mode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's webinar, Growing the Evidence Base for Mentoring, the Research, Lessons Learned, and Long-Lasting Impact of Public-Private Ventures. We're really excited to have everyone and our panelists with us today. And I think this is going to be a great conversation about mentoring research and kind of how the youth mentoring field has grown its evidence and our understanding of our work over time. My name is Michael Geringer. I'm with Education Northwest with our National Mentoring Center. And as you can see up on the screen here, we've got a lot of other contributors to these collaborative mentoring webinars. And as you guys have probably figured out if you've attended a few of these over the last few months, that these are kind of a different webinar experience. The goal of these is to be a little bit more conversational, and we kind of like the idea of mentoring practitioners, researchers, and policymakers all kind of gathering once a month to basically talk shop about our work and about relevant topics. So we have an excellent panel today. I'll introduce them in just a minute. We've also got chat as part of the webinar experience, so you can talk to each other, talk to the hosts, and so forth. And then we'll also be doing Q&A, and I'll kind of explain that in just a minute here. But I just wanted to take a second to kind of honor and recognize all of the different partners that are helping today. I'll be moderating the conversation with our panelists. Celeste and Sarah will be monitoring questions that you all submit throughout the webinar. And we're going to try and weave as many of the audience questions in as possible today, because I know you probably all have a lot of questions for our panel. We also have Marissa and Dana will be helping out with the chat section, so feel free to kind of keep the conversation lively and engaging there as well. And April at the Minnesota Partnership is going to be managing the technology and the slides and visuals and all of that stuff. So welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I just want to address, a couple of common questions that kind of come up in the middle of these webinars. Afterwards, all attendees are going to receive an email with information about how to get a copy of these slides. We'll send out a link to the recording on the SlideShare website. And any other information that's kind of related to what comes up today. We'll be sharing those after the webinar. We have been sending folks to the mentoring forums that we run here at Education Northwest to kind of keep the conversation going after these webinars, but unfortunately we're going to be taking that website down at the end of this month. So I think what we're going to do from now on to kind of encourage an ongoing conversation and sharing of resources is going to be sending folks to the new Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring website that Gene Rhodes and some other folks have launched to try and create a little central hub for mentoring research and discussions about research. There's a post already in the forum section there about today's webinar, and I think immediately afterwards I'll be heading over there to kind of answer questions people have, and I encourage everybody to go and kind of participate in the comments there as well. Also, after today's webinar, we're going to be sending out a brief survey. You'll get that in your email, so please take some time to fill that out. It helps us kind of streamline these things, make them better over time, and we really appreciate your feedback. As I noted, we want today to be a really participatory experience. We muted everybody's phones for kind of the best sound quality. But if you go over on the right-hand side, you should all see a panel called Questions. That's where we're going to be you feel free to type in your questions there. And like I said, we're going to try and weave as many of those in throughout the conversation today, and Celeste and Sarah will be helping us with that. Before we get started with our panel, I just want to do a couple of quick polls to kind of find out who's with us today. So April's put the first poll up now, and just give folks a few minutes to respond around your level of experience in the field. Okay. Do we have some results, April? Okay, kind of a good blend of beginner, experienced, and expert. So I think, we'll probably have questions at all different levels for our panelists today. And one last poll we want to do before we get started, just around what your role is in your mentoring program. We have different types of guests and panelists on these webinars, and it's always interesting to see which types of mentoring professionals show up for these. Okay, who do we have in the audience today? Okay, a couple of funders, welcome, feel generous, and a couple of TA providers, a fellow researcher, and most of you seem to be mentoring program staff at various levels. So welcome to everybody today. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. So I want to briefly kind of review what we're going to cover on today's webinar. Our focus today is the work of public-private ventures, which unfortunately closed this past July after about 35 years of kind of conducting, really groundbreaking research, not only in youth mentoring but in other areas. The mission of their organization was to improve the effectiveness of policies, programs, and community initiatives, and especially those that were focused on serving vulnerable populations or vulnerable communities. They accomplished a lot of their work not only through researching new model programs, but also studying existing initiatives and even creating their own initiatives. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. I think that kind of combination of research but also model development is a little bit rare in this field. And over the years, they have produced a wealth of information and knowledge around workforce development, community health, prisoner reentry, faith-based programming, out-of-school time, and of course youth mentoring, which is what we'll be mostly talking about today. Personally, I can't think of any organization that has contributed more to our collective understanding of youth mentoring than PPV. I personally owe them a huge debt of gratitude in my own work. When we first started the National Mentoring Center here, they were our very first partner in that effort. They were back in 1998. They were kind of really building on their early research into youth mentoring, and we really brought them on to kind of help us produce tools and resources that were mainly used by the OJJDP-funded JUMP grantees. I don't know if any of the old-timers in the audience today remember JUMP from back in the day, but those materials have grown and been adapted over time and literally have been used by tens of thousands of programs and practitioners. And so before we get started, I just want to say that I'm thrilled to have our panelists today because I feel a very strong kind of bond with them and a lot of gratitude about everything that they've provided our field. In addition to kind of that Big Brothers research that I think most of us know them for, they've also created and replicated the Amachi program model, and we have Wilson Good on today to talk about that a little bit. A wonderful blend of kind of secular and faith-based groups coming together to serve children of incarcerated parents. And I think they also really broke a lot of new ground on kind of the diversity we see in mentoring today, studying therapeutic uses of mentoring, mentoring in schools and other settings, group mentoring. They really covered a lot in their work over the years. So to that end, before I introduce the panel, I want to do one more poll, kind of asking the audience here what your familiarity is with PPV's research and how you've used it over the years. April, do we have that poll? There you go. I think all of us kind of have come at their work from different angles and used it in different ways, and so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to just see, pick any of these that you've done. You can choose multiple ones on this poll. Okay, what are the results looking like here, April? Okay. So everyone seems to have at least passing familiarity with their work. You know, I'm happy to see that at least some of you have been inspired to evaluate your own efforts because of what they've done. I'm also happy to see that top one, use their research to influence a funder or policymaker. I think the work at PPV has had a lot of influence in the policy arena around mentoring, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. We've got three folks from the PPV years with us today. First is Wilson Good. Welcome, sir. He's the director of and organizer of the nationally acclaimed Amachi program, which I just mentioned. And that's a national faith-based mentoring model for the children of incarcerated parents. And throughout today, we'll be talking a little bit about the legacy of that work. We also have Jean Grossman with us today. She served as Senior Vice President of Research at PPV and is currently both a lecturer at Princeton University and a Senior Fellow at MDRC. Welcome, Jean.
Hello.
And joining us all the way from Vienna is Carla Herrera, who served as a Senior Research Fellow at PPV. And most of you are probably familiar with Carla's work for her kind of groundbreaking examination of school-based mentoring and really looking closely at Big Brothers Big Sisters, both adult and peer school-based mentoring. So welcome to everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, great. So I think I want to start our discussion today by kind of just, you know, we're going to do three things on this conversation today. We're going to look back at the legacy of your work. I want to talk a little more specifically about the lessons you all have learned from evaluating mentoring programs, because I think that's as much an art as it is a science. And then we'll wrap up today by kind of looking at what you guys think are kind of future directions for mentoring research, and talk a little bit about kind of what's next for the three of you in your work. But I want to start by kind of looking back at the huge amount of research that you all generated for this field. You know, and kind of looking at the sum total of all the work you've done on mentoring over the years, I'm curious to know what you guys feel stands out the most, what you're most proud of, and what do you think has been most helpful to mentoring programs?
Should any one of us start? We can all start talking at once.
Anyone can chime in. Anyone can go.
I think this is Jean. I think probably the thing that I'm most proud of was that first study. That has been the pinnacle of my career. I've never done anything that has had such a major effect of really improving the lives of people on the ground, and that was the whole reason I wanted to be a field researcher rather than just an academic, is I really wanted to improve the lives of people. And I think that study alone really helped fuel the expansion of mentoring, and so that I'm really proud of. I think the other thing I was thinking of that I think has had a fair amount of effect, and I'm happy with, is the work that I've done with Jean Rhodes to try to dig into the practices associated with more impactful programs, looking at match length or relationship quality, or the type of mentors, how mentors and mentees interact with each other. And so that's another area where I'm particularly proud of the work that we've done.
This is Wilson. I agree with Jean. I think that the 1995 Making a Difference study was groundbreaking work in the mentoring field, and really brought tremendous credibility to the work that had been done, and continues to bring credibility to the work that has been done. And even though the study is 17, 18 years old at this point, there are people who still refer to it and still rely on it and still remember it, and it remains, I think, just a major study in the field at the present time. And I coupled that with the work that was done by Jacoby on the Amachi program early on that kind of talked about what the Amachi program was all about, which relied on the Big Brother, Big Sisters making a different study back in 1995. And what brought credibility to Amachi was that done by Jacoby and also the Big Brother, Big Sisters. And each time we referred to the Amachi program, we talked about using and relying on the learning that we had from that study of Big Brothers, Big Sisters.
Excuse me, I agree with Jean and Wilson that the 95 BBBS community-based mentoring impact study was definitely our most influential mentoring study, but I think some of our other work has also offered the field really rich information that has also shaped its direction. For example, the qualitative work by Stiles and Morrow that described how mentors approach their relationships and how they how these relationships worked. I think that really influenced the direction of the field and how people think about mentoring relationships. For me personally, I'm personally most proud of the work that we've done in school-based mentoring. We started that work when school-based mentoring was just beginning to grow, and I feel like our work and the work that stemmed from it has been really important for the field. For example, the impact study and the work that continues to be published from the data set by our PPV team, Jean Rhodes, Sarah Schwartz, Michael Karcher, continues to provide the field with a wealth of knowledge on how to approach that program model.
Great. Yeah, no, and I think, you guys, obviously, that first impact study still really resonates today, but I'm glad that you all mentioned the qualitative work, kind of looking a little more closely at the how of how those results were achieved, and not only looking at kind of program practices, but I really appreciated your efforts over the years to kind of unpack what's happening at the relationship level and kind of find out what it is that these volunteers are doing that's kind of creating that impact. I had one more question around that impact study, because I think that's still, like I said, still resonating today. And I remember when I came into mentoring, it seemed like that impact study really was, the launching point for the huge expansion of mentoring that we see today. And I guess I've always wondered, were you guys surprised by that? I mean, obviously researchers never really know or even can control how their work is going to be consumed, but it seemed like policymakers, both in the government and private funders, really latched onto that, and that really spurred a lot of growth. And so I just was curious, did that surprise you? Did you kind of anticipate that?
This is Jean. It didn't surprise me, but actually what did surprise me was that it was slower than expected. I think I certainly was still relatively naive about how the world had worked, and here I had found, we had found that mentoring has effects in a broad number of areas. It was, at the time, pretty much every study of youth programs was coming out that they were not effective, and here we found something that was effective not just in one domain, but in a vast array of domains. And I thought, wow, that's the way the world's supposed to work, is, if you find something effective, everybody should want to know that, and the field should just explode. And one of the sort of interesting things that I learned in the early months after that, we briefed, after we released it, and we briefed the funders, and it was really hard to get the press to pick up a good news story. It turned out, luckily, funders were paying attention to it, so mentoring programs were doing pretty well. But it actually was pretty hard to get the word out because it just didn't grab people. And you know, it wasn't. Newspapers thought, well, this isn't going to sell anything. This is a positive story, and negative stories are the ones that sell. So that was. It was sort of, I learned something. It's working the way it should work, except it's actually a harder thing to do than you would think.
Sure. Okay. You know, yeah, I think, you know, it's always hard to kind of anticipate, you know, how findings like that will be received and adopted. You know, there's a big push with the current administration now around identifying programs that work and replicating them and bringing them to scale. But, you know, I think you're right in noting that sometimes it can be hard to kind of get the word out and get that message received by the people that need to hear it. Kind of to that end, a similar question, you know, I've seen your work referenced in so many ways by so many different programs. I mean, for years and years and years, I would see, you know, mentoring programs that were not Big Brothers Big Sisters programs and were not part of that study, kind of when they were asked, you know, what can your program achieve, and they would talk, you know, trot out these statistics from the outcomes from your impact study, even though that wasn't really what their program was doing. And so I think at a broad level, you know, I've been curious as to what you guys feel the field has misinterpreted about your research, or have you felt at times like your research was used in ways that were kind of inaccurate or at a crossroads with, you know, kind of what you were hoping people would do with the research?
Well, I think especially the early one, and I'll let Carla talk about her work too. You're exactly right. The 95 study has and continues to be used to justify everything, and especially, you know, for us old-timers, you know, shortly after it came out, every program, no matter what it did, decided to call itself a mentoring program because mentoring worked, and so they were using the study to justify, you know, a vast range of things that, you know, some of us today would call mentoring, but even today we wouldn't call some of the things that wanted to claim to be mentoring programs. So it did concern me. It didn't so much concern me that other kinds of community-based programs were using this to justify their expansion or adoption. But what did start after a bunch of years to worry me a bit was that because the mentors are the constraint, really, that there's so many kids who could benefit, and yet there's so few, relatively few mentors who are willing to come forward. Really creative programs started using really creative ways of sort of leveraging mentors, like school-based mentoring, like group mentoring, or email mentoring, e-mentoring. And again, they were still using the same 95 study to say, look, mentoring works. And I never doubted that they probably did work, but the question is they might work in a very, very different way. And I remember, especially early on, it was the school-based mentoring that really started taking off. And many, many, many programs were starting to add community-based, school-based programming to their already existing community-based programming. And so I went back at that point to funders to say, you know, it is mentoring, but it's in a very different setting, and, you know, I'm really curious. I think we should do a study to figure out, you know, does it have the same kind of effects? Does it work in the same kind of way? And it actually took us, and Carly can talk more about this, a long time to put together funders, a group of funders who are willing to pay for a study on school-based mentoring, because at least early on they all said, well, you know, it's mentoring. We know mentoring works. We don't have to evaluate a different kind. But luckily, Carla went on to find that there are some differences, and yet it's still effective. So, Carla, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, it took years, Jean.
Yeah, years and years, about 10 years probably.
Yeah, it was a long time coming. I think people like bottom lines, and the bottom line from, and this is kind of going back to your original question, Michael. So the bottom line from the school-based mentoring impact study was taken to be school-based mentoring works. and high school volunteers, for example, are not effective. I think the findings are more complicated than that. I might instead say something like, well-run Big Brothers Big Sisters school-based mentoring programs are effective, and well-supported high school volunteers can be effective, but unless they're provided with additional supports, they're actually much less effective than their adult counterparts. Now, who wants to say that mouthful, right? People like short and succinct, and I think that's something similar happened with the community-based mentoring study. It's like mentoring works, and that's people ran with that. My response to the high school volunteer findings isn't to stop using high school volunteers, it's to study them more to figure out how to use them smartly. I've also been very fortunate to have worked with Big Brothers Big Sisters of America over the years. They're just real leaders in the field in turning research into practice, and I think they're doing an excellent job of trying to get our findings out into the field. It just takes a huge amount of time and effort to make that happen at a national level. So I do think on the whole practitioners are using our research and kind of getting it into practice fairly quickly. I think PPV's research has benefited from that. Our connection with policymakers and practitioner help to get things out fairly quickly, but it still takes a long time.
Yeah. I agree with what Jean and Carla have said, but I just want to just add something else to this, and that is that what I've found is that unless there is training of the mentoring groups, especially if you go beyond Big Brothers Big Sisters, and there are literally tens of thousands of groups out there now who are doing this work. Unless there is training that stresses and emphasizes the need for research, the need for evidence-based practices in mentoring, the need for protocol, the need for checks and balances in what they're doing, that so often they're driven by the money coming in and not so much the quality of the work which has been done. And so I'm a big fan of training. I'm a big fan of that no one should just start a mentoring program and not have some place to go to talk with someone who's done this work before in terms of what needs to be done in order to make sure that you end up with the kind of product that you're looking for.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, Wilson. As a training and TA provider myself, I couldn't agree more. And I still, to this day, I field questions from folks that I think, going back to what Jean said, take this, kind of simpler view of it, of like, oh, mentoring works, and anything that I kind of do that's tinged with mentoring is going to be successful. And I'm kind of happy to note that, I think our field has matured a lot in the last 10, 15 years where, I'm hearing less and less of that. And I think there's a recognition now that, regardless of kind of what your program structure is going to look like, you need to think it through. There needs to be a logic model and theory of change that makes sense. And then you're going to need help. And, I think a lot of us at state partnerships and at other service providers have tried to provide that support over the years. I think like Jean's new Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring website, I think will be instrumental in that moving forward. But I'm glad you brought that up because I think, that's still, practitioners in this field still need a place to turn when they've got questions because even though we have a lot of research, there's still gaps in kind of what we know. Wilson, since you were just speaking here, I want to talk about another aspect of PPV that I've found to be really interesting in how that organization approached its work, and that's, as I mentioned earlier, you guys both researched models and programs, and you also developed programs and kind of would create these programs in order to study them and replicate them if they were successful. And I think, Amachi is a really great example of that. And I think Could you maybe just talk a little bit about kind of how Amachi first got launched and the role PPV played in that, and kind of how that grew over time?
Dr. John Julio from the University of Pennsylvania was at the time in 98, 99, both a board member of Big Brothers Big Sisters, Public-Private Ventures, and Prison Fellowship, as well as being a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and was also doing some work with PPV on research and very heavily involved in that. And so the idea of a program to focus on mentoring children of incarcerated parents came out of his brain and his experience with these four organizations, and thought it would be wonderful if a program could be, in fact, organized that would take into account the work that Big Brothers Big Sisters is doing, the work that Prison Fellowship was doing in terms of getting the names of children from inmates in prisons, as well as the research work that was being done at the University of Pennsylvania at the time, and then public-private ventures research work, and especially relying very heavily on the 1995 study. Out of that came a program that ended up focusing on 4 sections of Philadelphia, South, Southwest, North Philadelphia, and West Kensington, and 42 congregations. And it became essentially at that time a program that sought to bring into the equation of mentoring the faith community, the congregations that could be partners with mentoring organizations in order to provide additional volunteers for the mentoring efforts that were going on. It turned out that the program very rapidly got legs. Before we knew it within New York City, and before we knew it within 12 states, and then within 3 years we were across the country with the program. So it became replicated, was replicated very, very rapidly across the country. I think there are probably 3 things I would say, not to take more time. One is that I think that by introducing congregations as partners in this mentoring field, and by the recruitment of mentors, not one at a time, but sometimes 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 and 50, and sometimes even 200 at a time, brought a new kind of approach in the mentoring field. And so they were able to then move from congregation to businesses and to schools and to fraternities and sororities and other people who could engage in this work. So I think that the second thing is that there was the ability to replicate what we had learned in the first couple of years. But the replication did not take place without training. And so as soon as the replication started, that was created by us, by PPV at the time, the Amachi Training Institute, that sought to train everyone who was trying to replicate the work that we were doing and how they ought to do it. And I thought that was a very strong statement that we made, that we did not want people using the name Amachi and using the kind of protocols that we had established that were pretty much the same as Big Brothers Big Sisters, and based upon, again, the study done in 1985. We did not want them using that without some type of training to go with it. And we found that people came from all across the country, and I think by over a period of 6, 7 years, some 3,600 people came from 1,000 different cities across the country, and we were able to replicate this program and to I think what I would say, take it to scale, and I think it all grew out of that idea that John DiIulio had back in 1988, 1989. I'll be glad to answer questions later, but I think that's enough for now.
Sure. Well, thank you for kind of giving us that story, Wilson. I think, you know, the thing that sticks out to me about what you just said was I think it would have been impossible to replicate it and take it to scale without that research component, because you know, the science on program implementation says, you know, it's not enough to just have a model program. You have to really understand what components of that model are kind of the core pieces, what can be modified in different locations, what can't be changed in different locations. And I think, you know, it's hard for me to picture Amachi finding the success that it had without that research piece. And I think, you know, a lot of the work that my organization is doing in K-12 education is around, you know, how do we take a model program, something that's worked in one setting, and how do we replicate that with some fidelity, but also the flexibility to kind of adapt to local circumstances. And I don't think you can do any of that if you haven't really deeply understood the initial implementation of it at the original site. I want to open it up to, oh, go ahead, Wilson.
I just say that clearly, without any question, two things. One is, without the 1995 study and without our reliance on that study, and without doing some basic performance work on each of the groups that we work with early on, and having not you know, real extensive research, but having something that we could say that confirmed the 1985 results that we were beginning to see with the Amachi program. Without those things, we could not have replicated and could not have grown it. So you're right. The connection between the 1995 study and the success of Amachi is there both forwards.
I do want to add, though, and one more thing, this is Jean, is it couldn't have happened just with the study. I can't imagine Amachi where it is without Wilson. It really was. Reverend Good just was amazing in the early years and continues to be amazing at being able to convince congregations and pastors and really push for this program. So I think it's a combination of having the research to know what are good models and having that, you know, charismatic leader who can really push it out.
That's right.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you brought that up, Jean. I mean, I seem to recall that being a finding of some of the other work that you did around faith-based initiatives, trying to kind of galvanize faith communities in different cities. And, you know, it seemed to always come down to, you know, do you have a charismatic leader? Do you have somebody that can kind of make things happen and get people energized? You know, I'm thinking of, like, you know, even things today like the Harlem Children's Zone. You know, if every city had a Ben Canada, that might go a little easier, but sometimes it really does come down to, you know, who's the face of an effort in a community. So thank you for that. I kind of want to open it up to audience questions here. Celeste and Sarah, do we have any questions from our participants today around kind of PPV's research?
We do have one. Florence asked, what are the next steps practitioners should take to impact the field of mentoring?
Carla, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can answer for researchers, but for practitioners, that's a tough one. I think the mentoring field, practitioners in the mentoring field, and I may be biased because I've worked mostly in mentoring as opposed to other areas, but I feel like practitioners in mentoring are very thirsty for research and really want to use our research in a way that can make a difference in their organizations. But I don't think researchers are as good at translating their research for practitioners. So I think if practitioners can just stay patient with us as we get better at relaying and communicating our findings and also doing the kind of research that you can use, I think you'll be in good shape. But I'll keep thinking on that one.
Well, let me say this, that I think that there is a real need for additional research. There are just so many different ways that people are seeking to provide mentoring, and the 1985 study was basically based upon one-to-one mentoring, and there, as e-mentoring, there's school-based, there's site-based, there's group mentoring. All of that are mentoring that I think that is important, but I don't think that we know enough at this point to indicate that it is valid enough to be able to say that we can really change the lives of young people, and perhaps someone know more than what I know do that. So I think that the next step in this is that we need to have some groundbreaking work like we had in 1985 with all these other mentoring models, so that we can have the assurance that if we're spending resources and spending time and involving adults in the lives of children, that it really is making a difference in the lives of those children, and it's bringing about real change. And so I would say that the next step is to look for research dollars to be able to kind of duplicate what was done in 1985 in these other areas.
Agreed, and I think that's going to continue to, I think, to be a challenge for our field. I mean, we're lucky that we have folks like David Dubois who are kind of doing these meta-analyses where they're kind of aggregating the research that is out there, and I think David's been able to show that all kinds of varieties of mentoring can be quite effective, but what those meta-analyses don't really do is they don't do a good job of kind of unpacking the how that impact is happening. I mean, he was able to identify a couple of kind of broad, program practices, but, the devil is always in the details. And, it may be that the best practices for a group-based mentoring program that's combined with an after-school program is way different than the best practices for an e-mentoring program aimed at some academic focus. Carla, I think it was you that said to me once, the main thing that came out of your school-based mentoring study was you realized that school-based mentoring is kind of a different animal, I believe was the quote you used, that yep. It may influence young people's lives through totally different mechanisms than the work of a community-based mentor, even though we tend to think of them as, oh, mentoring is mentoring.
Right.
Yep.
And Samira actually, Carla is actually has personally done a range of things. We didn't do a random assignment evaluation of group mentoring, but her early work on group mentoring also found, not at all surprising when you start to think about it, that the adult is really important in group mentoring, but what's happening between the children themselves, the group, the young people, is also affecting the. So I think there are, there are the different mechanisms, and how to run the best group mentoring program or the e-mentoring program or some other kind of mentoring program. You don't really know until you really get in there and study it.
I think that's one of the things that PPV really offered the field, is kind of making that statement. Mentoring is not mentoring. It depends the context. It depends how many kids you've got in the room. It depends. All of those things make a difference. And so I think because we studied such a wide range of programs, we kind of scratched the surface of a lot of different models and then gave it to the field and said, look, explore these further, because this is not one concept. It's a lot of different things.
Right.
Sure.
And I think one thing that listeners can do is, if they get involved in an evaluation, to push their evaluators to do good, solid qualitative work that PPV always did when it did impact studies. And just doing an impact study is really almost useless unless you know what it is that created those positive findings and where did you get the bigger positive findings and what were the practices. And I think one of the things that PPV was very good at was trying to really use its results to help the field think about what are the critical practices and what do we want to improve in and what are the next steps where programs could get better. And so I just hope that doesn't get lost with PPV's loss.
Sure. Thank you. Celeste, Sarah, do we have any more audience questions at this point?
Yeah, several questions are coming in regarding if there is any research, and there's a variety of topics that people are writing in on, all kinds of things that people, I'm assuming, are doing programs on. If you have any questions that's specific about the PPV research, that would be great to ask. Instead of these, we're getting a lot of questions that are about all kinds of different research that might be out there. We do have one particular question for Wilson, though. Justin asks, what has your program found to be the most successful in recruiting quality mentors? This always seems to be a challenge for all organizations, and on the other side, youth are in abundance.
Repeat the last part.
Yeah, he said it always seems to be a challenge for organizations to recruit mentors, although it's not necessarily a challenge to find the youth for the mentoring programs.
If I had that answer, I probably tell it across the country. But I do really think that that you have to concentrate on unconventional sources, on smaller organizations, on smaller groups where people gather together and meet. And you have to work with small neighborhood organizations, small congregations, small businesses, where you can go in and get people to respond to you. I think that the biggest challenge that most people have, they go after the biggest business they can find, the biggest congregation they can find, and you just run across a whole lot of bureaucracy and red tape when you do that. I think that working with smaller organizations and groups and congregations, I've found to be the most effective way, and then concentrating on organizations. For example, if you need men, then you go to organizations that work with men, and some that you've never gone to before. Just think about who work with men and where you find men and what do they do, and et cetera. From basketball teams in neighborhoods, from sports teams in neighborhoods, from people who are part of men's group in neighborhood. You can do all of that. So I've found that I've gotten more success with unconventional types of recruitment from not normally those organizations that are well known in communities, but if you dig deep enough and talk to enough people, you can find out those that you can yield you great results, in my view.
Great, thanks. And I think, Wilson, you touched on this earlier. The genius elements of Amachi was in approaching, these faith groups. Not only are you finding a decent, number of people there that you can kind of put the opportunity to mentor in front of, but there's also a really strong kind of peer pressure element there, and especially if you have the pastor or the head of the congregation on board and kind of delivering a message for you on your behalf. That kind of group dynamic, I think, in mentor recruitment can really help that. I just want to point out, Celeste, you mentioned that we're getting a lot of different questions about different pieces of research that may or may not be out there. What I will do is on the Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring site, if we can collect those questions, I'd be happy to go over the next day or so and kind of take a stab at answering some of those questions myself. You know, I've got a pretty good handle on kind of what research is out there, and I'd be happy to kind of point some folks in the right direction if they're looking for evidence of a certain particular model or approach to mentoring. I think right now I want to transition into kind of the second topic we wanted to cover today, which is the art of evaluating mentoring programs. And Jean, you started to go there a minute ago when you were talking about kind of the importance of not only doing an impact study, you know, but also looking at like how you got the young people from point A to point B. If you don't know why they're at point B at the end of your program, there's precious little you can do to kind of improve and change that over time. I want to do one last poll of the audience here before we kind of dig into how to evaluate programs. Just kind of curious about how many of you have done a formal evaluation and kind of your experience with evaluation. So as you can see here, we've got you know, kind of a few questions about the type of evaluation you've done, and even, you know, if you regret having done an evaluation. I've heard that kind of thing. Well, but it's a serious topic. I mean, you know, one of the things I wanted to explore with you guys today is you know, big brothers, big sisters, I think, could afford to take the risk that they took in working with you all. They had, you know, incredible brand recognition. They're a very large, very well-respected national organization, but, you know, we've all seen programs and initiatives in the mentoring arena kind of, you know, have some real negative consequences if their impact evaluation is, you know, mediocre or worse. You know, one of my biggest regrets in mentoring was, you know, being part of the Department of Education school-based mentoring grants. I, you know, thought the evaluation of that was, you know, from a science point of view, well done, but how that information was used in a policy way, it just simply resulted in the whole initiative being cut, even though I think there were a number of, you know, strong pieces of evidence that it was a good and growing initiative. So we've got our poll results here. Not surprisingly, you know, 3/4 of folks wish they could do more. I'm encouraged by that second bar, the green one, that they've researched a new aspect or an innovation in their program. I think that gets to what the advice you were giving there, Jean, about, you know, studying the mechanisms that produce the impact. Unfortunately, 10% of you still run screaming from the so hopefully you will not run screaming from this webinar. These things. Jean, you wrote a really great kind of policy paper or white paper called Evaluating Mentoring Programs a few years ago. And in that, you talked a lot about kind of, you know, best practices for evaluating a program, but you also talked a little bit about kind of common mistakes programs make when they're doing an evaluation. Could you talk about your experience with that a little bit?
Yeah, let me start with the positive instead of the negative. I think I would encourage all programs to start evaluating themselves for themselves, not for their funders, but so that they know what's working and what's not working. And the kinds of things you can do, one thing we have, a common mistake is that people think that outcomes, that what kids, you know, the outcomes you see in kids, that's the same thing as the impact of the program. So that if, you know, a child's grades go up over the year, it has to do with your program rather than school. There's so much that's in the that touches the life of a child, positive and negative, that are going to go into affecting what they look like at the end of the year or at the end of the period, whatever you're looking at them. And so what's good is to try to compare them to like other people, But I recognize that if you're not a researcher and you're not in a big study, you're most likely not going to go out and find some other comparison group of kids. But you actually, with relatively little investment, you have and can quickly build up data that you get all the time. So actually, Kyoki Hansen, who used to work at Big Brothers Big Sisters, came up with this. And I thought it was just a brilliant solution, which was if you collected outcome data, namely collect data on the things that you're going to want to gauge your program against, on the application form for everybody who applies to your program. You will now know for kids who come to your program who are in 5th grade, on average, what do 5th grade kids like that? How do they feel about themselves? What kind of relationship do they have with their parents? What kind of grades are they getting in school? And then what you could do is then when you have a 4th grader who's been in the program for a year, and they're now 5th grade, you could say, well, our 5th graders have been in the program for a year. You could compare them to the applicant pools who show up at 5th grade. So that may not be perfect, but that's actually really good, and you already have, it's easy to get the data because it's just part of your application project or process. So that, I think, is a very nice way to be able to gauge your impacts on kids.
Sure. Carla, how about you? What advice do you have for mentoring programs that are, thinking about undertaking an evaluation? Kind of what advice or cautions would you have for them?
Well, I think one thing that Jean said really resonated with me, and that's like when trying to evaluate your program, don't just think about doing it for someone else. Do it for yourself. So don't just, if you're going to put together some questions to ask mentors or parents or youth, don't only ask about the things you do well, because you won't learn a lot from those. What you want to do is ask mentors or parents or youth who are ending their involvement with the program why they're ending and what you could have done better to prevent them from ending. For this reason, I think closure surveys are very telling. Develop a quick one-page survey to give to your mentors, youth, and parents when matches close to understand why, so that you can prevent more closures down the road. I think another very common mistake I see is that a lot of programs, most programs I think, only collect outcomes data on kids who remain in the program. This tells you how kids who remain in your program, kids who can make it through the whole year of the program or however long the program lasts, are doing, but it doesn't tell you anything about the kids who don't stick around. To yield a really fair assessment of your program, you really should try to study kids who end their involvement as well. And again, that goes back to my earlier point that figuring out why matches close, what went wrong, is the best kind of feedback you can get to improve.
And I have another suggestion too, is sometimes I think what programs can do pretty easily and can really help them is if they're thinking about tweaking the program. Do we change the setting in which we ask people to be? Do we group people together, or do we keep in school-based mentoring? Do we group them in one room, or do we keep them all apart? Or there could be practices that you don't really know the answer. On one hand, it might be better if they're all together. Maybe on the other hand, it's better if they're apart. And if you could do like little mini experiments where you say, okay, in some schools we're going to, and rather than do it intentionally, if you build in like a little lottery and you say, okay, we're going to randomly pick, in this set of schools they're all going to meet together, and in that set of schools they're going to meet apart. And then just eyeball and look at the end, was there a difference? And again, if you can complement that with doing some interviews with the mentors and the youth to see, what it was like under these two different scenarios, programs can learn a lot by just sort of, randomly trying out. You know, it's piloting a new version. And before you spread it to everybody, let's pilot it, see how, because there could be operational problems, it could not work, it could be a lot of reasons why you want to kind of start it small. And if you randomly pick where you're going to do it or which matches get, you know, 4 times as many calls from the program, or, you know, whatever the change is, if you pilot it on a random group and then look at that, look between the different groups, that can tell you a lot of information.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I mean, I've heard of programs doing that. We have a new training curriculum. We're going to test its effectiveness by kind of having one group get the old training, someone else getting another batch getting the new training. Celeste and Sarah, do we have any audience questions around program evaluation?
We do, Mike. We have a great question from Esther, who wants to know, or is kind of starting off by saying there are some areas where mentoring research is inconclusive and or there is a lack of reputable research. What are some comparable fields of research that practitioners can look to when the mentoring research does not suffice? Should they be looking in counseling? Should they be looking in psychology, youth development? Any thoughts from our panelists?
All of the above, I would say. I think depending on what the question is, you know, trying to find research in settings that are the most like it, or at least that what's the crucial element of the thing you're trying where there's not good research, and then trying to find it in one of those other. I think you've identified, or Esther has identified exactly the set of research literatures you'd want to look through.
And a lot of the out-of-school time literature as well, like in the out-of-school time literature, adult-youth relationships are really central. I mean, that's a really big part of what that literature is about, and I think that's another area that really kind of feeds nicely in with the you know, that communicates nicely with the mentoring work.
Yeah, I actually think that, yeah, I've done a lot of work in both fields, and the after-school area or out-of-school time programs often are sort of almost group mentoring. Not exactly, because they're more usually instrumentally focused around a particular topic or a particular skill, but you know, a lot of group mentoring is like that. So you could almost view much of that literature as you know, saying, well, it's really group mentoring.
That's right.
Great. Sarah, any other questions from our audience?
Well, we've got one other one from Kaina, who's asking, and this is a very interesting question I know David Dubois has addressed in different presentations as well. Is there a certain criteria that mentoring programs need to meet in order to become evidence-based?
What does David say?
Yeah. Tell us.
I suppose I would say that if a program has the components that evidence has pointed to as being really important, like good screening, good training, good supervision, and has a model that is not too far off of something that has been evaluated, then they could call themselves evidence-based.
If they follow the elements of effective practice.
If they follow the, yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense, Gene.
And that's a question that I get a lot. I think, you know, folks tend to think of mentoring as having, you know, some of these kind of out-of-the-box program models like you see, for example, in, say, bullying prevention programs. There's, you know, 5 or 6 well-established bullying prevention program models that schools and other organizations can kind of just implement. And, you know, people kind of get grumpy sometimes when I say, I don't know if mentoring really is like that. I think, you know, there's these elements that have kind of been proven to be, you know, part of the mix in making a program effective. But, you know, Gene, I think you noted, you know, the best evidence for your own program is the research you do on your own efforts. Nothing will ever be more relevant to what you do than that. So,
I mean, I think I've always thought the magic of mentoring is that it's so flexible. It's an adult meeting the needs of a kid today, whatever those needs are, and so it's less. It's a very flexible delivery system. It's a flexible support delivery system, and so it can look really different in different settings. But there are these sort of basic components of building a relationship and having a relationship supported, because it's hard to maintain relationships, especially with someone that, if it is someone you don't know. So I think the elements of effective mentoring are a really good sort of summary of what creates a mentoring program, a good mentoring program.
Well, I think even just our field, so the field of mentoring as a field has so much research backing it. I think relative to other fields, we're really pretty far ahead of the game. And so just having something like the elements of effective practice, people, it's just a wonderful, wonderful resource to be able to say, look, I follow these specific practices, which I think a lot of other fields don't have.
Right.
Yep. While we're on the topic of evaluating programs, I wanted to ask, you've given several tips for kind of programs that are thinking about or want to do more evaluation. And I agree with you, Gene. I think evaluation should always be driven by one's own curiosity in their program. But the reality is a lot of people's, at least data collection efforts, are driven by funders and what funders want to know about kind of the return on their investment. What all would you all say to funders and policymakers about how we evaluate mentoring programs, and kind of what can they do to kind of help move the field along in ways that are proactive and not necessarily punitive if the results are kind of not glowing right off the bat?
Well, I think that this has become it has been always been a question out there, because negative results have never been a good thing. But it feels like, today it's so much more not a good thing, because that the whole field in funding is being pushed towards evidence-based. And so opening yourself up to doing an evaluation is a very scary thing. And so what I like to, I often view part of my job as educating funders, and I spend a lot of time talking to funders about doing evaluation. And a good executive director could say the same thing that I'm saying to them, which is, the truth is most of the programs out there that are being funded have either no effect or only very small effects. And you just don't know it because they don't have, and you're funding things that in fact are not that effective. And they may be using evaluation methods that are really stacked in favor of them. And so again, you're not, they can bring, quote, evidence that makes them look effective, but if they really, let a hard look, outside group look at them, or to do it in a more rigorous way, you'd find that the effects are either zero or quite small. So don't you, funder, want to fund a program that is interested in improving? And it's willing to take the risk to know that it wants to know what doesn't work. And I might say, if I was the executive director, I am collecting this information because I want to know what works. I don't want to waste my time. And I think you should be funding me because if it's not working as well as I think it is, I'm going to change. And because I know it's not going to. But if I wasn't willing to take a hard look at it, and feed you a good story, and you're willing to buy the story, you would be finding things that actually aren't working. And I'm actually using data to make my program as good as it can. And maybe the first evaluation won't come out as positively as I like it, but we're going to keep working until we get positive findings.
I think another kind of important message is one that you had said earlier, Jean, and also Michael, in talking about unpacking, but never just ask whether something works, but dig deeper and ask the whys and the hows. If a program doesn't work and you've asked the why and the how, that can help you understand how to improve it. And so that's really one way you can learn a whole lot from these big studies, even if they don't come out in your favor. I think PPV was was pretty firm on this, that we believed impact studies were really great when they're warranted, that you should be pretty far along in your program with at least some evidence that it works before you dive into an impact study. If you conduct these big studies on new programs or programs that are still shaking out their program model, it's really dangerous, and as you were saying earlier, Michael, it can really hurt the field by taking programs out of the game that really had some great potential if they had just been given a little more time to sort themselves out.
Yeah, one of the things I often say to funders who want to do that kind of, evaluate programs when they're brand new, is to say, why spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars to know that a poorly implemented program doesn't work? It would be a lot cheaper to just go in and do an implementation study and say, look, all the components aren't really there, or nobody's showing up, or the kids are only staying half the time they should have. That's a lot cheaper. Why do impact study until you know you have a good program, that you're actually evaluating the program you wanted to evaluate?
That's right. I mean, BBBSA had almost 100 years to sort itself out before we did the 95 study. So.
And even before we did the 95 study, we had worked with them for 3 years before that started. We have the gift set of their 4 reports that were done, and with the 95 impact study being the last of them. But the first one was a program study, and then there was one on volunteers and how to recruit volunteers. And then there was the relationship formation one. And only after we felt, that we really understood that this program was, in place and solid, and what we would do to pick sites that actually we knew what a good site was or a bad site. Then we did the impact evaluation.
Great. Well, thank you for that, guys. We're getting up to the end of our time here today, but I wanted to close by just asking each of you kind of what do you think are the big unanswered questions in mentoring, and kind of what do you see as being the next thing that researchers kind of need to turn their attention to if we're going to keep growing this field?
Go ahead, Wilson.
Big unanswered question is, where will the resources come from in order to continue the work that we do? Will the foundation community, will the federal government, will state government, will the United Ways across the country see mentoring as a field they ought to invest in? And I think that the jury is very much out on that question at the time. So I think that's a big unanswered question now. And although we can do volunteer work, there's need for dollars in order to make sure that these things work effectively.
I think a related question is kind of, what do different forms of mentoring cost? I think our estimates of the cost of mentoring are really outdated, but funders still use them to determine how much serving a given child should cost. And that leaves very little wiggle room for quality improvement in programs. So I think updating those estimates will really help the field. I think another big question is, how do you make a good match? Why do some people click and others don't? Figuring out this whole chemistry question will be huge, as so many matches don't make it because the mentor and youth just don't click.
Well, that's really good.
Yeah.
I suppose what I would say is I've always felt, the number of mentors is the constraint, the big constraint on mentoring really getting even bigger than it is now. And so I think both research on what can bring out more mentors, more volunteers, what can keep volunteers participating longer, that's a really fruitful place that we can look, but also looking at models like group mentoring models, or there may be others that I'm not thinking of, where we can leverage mentors to a greater degree so that they can help the lives of more kids. And so that's a challenge as much to the program side to think of these new innovative models, and then on the research side to make sure that they're still effective.
Great. Well, those are all interesting topics, and I could talk to you, all three of you, for another 2 or 3 hours about this, but unfortunately we're up against our time. I want to thank you guys for joining us today, and thank our audience for kind of listening in and asking questions today. Once again, just as a reminder, we're going to be sending out an email after this, so we'll have a link to the recording. If you want to keep kind of the conversation going, head over to the Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring website, and I will be kind of manning the comments there today. If Jean, Carla, Wilson, if you guys get a chance to stop in over there, that would be great too. And if there's any kind of research questions still lingering, like I said earlier, I'll take a stab at answering some of those today. And as I noted earlier, please fill out the little online survey about our webinars when you're done here today. So I just wanted to say thank you again to our panel for joining us today. You guys were fantastic, and you know, I wish all three of you the best of luck in your future work. And once again, thank you so much for all the contributions you've made to mentoring, and I know you guys aren't done yet, so we'll talk to you again down the road.
This is, excuse me, this is, oh sure. Yeah, this is April. I wanted to say too, thanks to the National Mentoring Center and the mentoring forums for hosting our promotion of the webinar series, keeping the archive and having that discussion place so through up until now. So we will get yeah, we'll get the promotion stuff for the upcoming webinars moved over. We'll have it on the mentor website and also on the forum. But it is up right now on the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota site, but I just don't want anybody to, it'll be on individual websites for all of the partner organizations, but if you're looking for that right now, that is where it is, but we will get that moved over to a spot for everybody to access so you don't have to jump around to all of our different websites. So thank you, Mike, for keeping that going on the forums and for providing that service for a long time.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Anita. Yeah, and just real quick, the next webinar in this series I forgot to mention will be November 15th, and that topic for that is we're going to be talking about how mentoring can impact and support kind of what's being called opportunity youth, or youth who are you know, disconnected is a term that I think we're hearing thrown around a lot around today's young people. So that'll be the focus in November. Then in December we're going to be taking a look about talking about National Mentoring Month and what programs can do to kind of take advantage of the resources and things around that. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next month. Thanks.